Hello and welcome to the latest Q&A video. This week I'm going to be focusing on a couple of questions I had relating to Kosovo. So DJ Medi 6619 asks, is it true that Kosovo, because of its non-membership at the UN, UNESCO, Interpol, Council of Europe and OSCE, can't be seen as an internationally recognised country? Great question. So look, this is a complex issue related to the subject of state recognition, which is an area that I'm absolutely fascinated in and I've done a lot of work on. I've written about at length. So look, what we have to think about is that recognition is originally emerged essentially at the end of the 18th century, and it was all about the emergence of the United States, because up until that point you had European powers that accepted each other. They knew who was what, who was who, fine. Then you had the successful attempt by the United States to break away from British rule. And this posed a question to these European powers. How do we accept a new country within our ranks? You know, what do we need to do? What conditions need to be met? And that really started to create this idea of recognition as we understand it today. But I think the important thing to realize is that you can have a concept of collective recognition where a group of states choose at the same time to all recognize a new state. But fundamentally, recognition is one sovereign state saying to another territory, we accept that you are equal to us. Not necessarily equal in terms of military power or economic might, but simply saying we recognize that that piece of territory that you claim, you have sovereign control of. It is your territory to do with as you want and to rule as you choose to see fit. So it's the way that countries tell each other that these lines on the map, we recognize that within those particular lines, there is a sovereign authority that controls it. So fundamentally, recognition is actually a sovereign decision of each individual sovereign state. So the argument runs that international organizations such as the United Nations, UNESCO, Interpol, Council of Europe, OSCE, all the ones that you mentioned, are actually irrelevant in this. And in actual fact, membership of the UN, we call it universal recognition because essentially it means that every country has recognized you. Now, that's not always the case. We can talk about some countries that are members of the UN that aren't recognized by every other country. I think there's about 6 countries that don't have full recognition by every other UN member. And, you know, Israel is clearly the obvious example. There are still many Muslim countries that refuse to recognize Israel, but there are a few others. So for, you know, odd outliers. So for example, you know, Armenia isn't recognized by Pakistan because of its conflict with Azerbaijan, but one hopes that now that that conflict seems to have been resolved, that, you know, Pakistan might change its position. But, you know, there are only, as I say, about 6 countries that fall into that category. So this is often something that's said. The UN can't recognize any country. That's not what its job is. It's not what to do. Its members will recognize. So what you end up in is a very strange, anomalous position with Kosovo and some of these other countries that have broken away from other countries that aren't members of the UN because they haven't been universally recognized, is that it depends on who you ask as to whether they're a country. So in the case of Kosovo, if you ask the Russian government or the Chinese government or the government of many other countries that haven't yet recognized it, and we don't know for certain how many countries have recognized Kosovo. It's the high watermark came in probably at around 113 of the 92 members. A number of those countries have since rescinded their recognition. And by the way, that is possible. But you can't just simply say, we don't recognize any sovereign authority. So effectively, the countries that have de-recognized Kosovo are simply, what they've said is that essentially they said, we recognise Kosovo as being independent from Serbia. We now understand that that was a hasty decision. We don't recognise it as having broken away from Serbia, but invariably saying, but we are open to a political decision which may allow Kosovo to become independent in our minds again at some point in the future. So you end up in a very contorted legal position. But essentially, the fundamental answer to your question is it's not worth, we shouldn't judge whether Kosovo is independent or not on the basis of whether it's joined international organizations, because you get into very, very complex territory. What really recognition is traditionally and fundamentally and legally about one state saying to another, we accept your sovereignty. So it rather depends on who you ask. Some organizations like to get beyond this problem by saying, we don't want to accept any countries unless they are UN members, because then that's what they're saying is that if the UN has accepted them as a member, which means that all the permanent members of the Security Council, so you've got Britain, you've got France, you've got Russia, you've got the United States and China, they've all agreed that this is now a sovereign independent country. The rest of the Security Council has made the recommendation to the General Assembly. 2/3 of the General Assembly have voted in favour of admitting this country to the United Nations. As far as we're concerned, that pretty much solves the matter, so we will take it in. So some organisations, rather than having a problem of do they accept Kosovo or do they accept some other territory that's broken away, it simply says, listen, we want UN membership. But officially speaking, UN membership is neither here nor there. So I hope that gives you an answer. The simple wrapping it all up is that recognition is essentially in the eye of the beholder. It depends who you ask. If a country is recognised, then to that country, Kosovo is a state. If it hasn't recognised Kosovo, then to that country, Kosovo isn't a state. So you end up in a rather complex position. So Milos Kovacevic asks, given how big of a precedent it sets in global politics, do you think that the EU should go back on its Kosovo decisions? Could an admission of a mistake remove the accusations of hypocrisy? For anyone who's followed the channel, and I've never really sort of hidden this, I was always very unhappy with the way that Kosovo unilaterally declared independence. Now, I know that they will be saying it wasn't a unilateral declaration of independence, it was a coordinated declaration of independence. I've spoken about this before. There's no such thing as a coordinated declaration of independence. It was a made-up term. In international law, you either have a declaration of independence where the country that you're breaking away from accepts it, and it's an agreed decision, in which case it's a perfectly legal decision, or the territory breaks away without the acceptance or permission of the country it's breaking away from, in which case it is unilateral. It has taken its own decision without the agreement. So in fact, it's binary. You either have an agreed process, such as, for example, Sudan was a very good example. South Sudan became independent from Sudan. They'd reached a peace agreement that allowed for a referendum. The South Sudanese voted for independence. Sudan was the first country to recognise it. It said, yes, we had the agreement. You've chosen to go your own way. Thank you. We accept that. Same happened with Serbia and Montenegro, that they had been within a single country, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. When that broke up, then you had a state union, which was like a confederal system between Serbia and Montenegro. And then in 2006, Montenegro voted for independence, and Serbia said, sorry to see you go, but we accept this. So those are consensual recognitions, consensual declarations of independence. There was no problem. South Sudan and Montenegro joined the United Nations within a couple of weeks after declaring independence. These were not contentious. Of course, Kosovo was a unilateral declaration of independence. Serbia hadn't agreed to it. So even though you had a number of big powers that had agreed to it and had accepted the need for it, it was a unilateral decision. So I understand why Serbia and many Serbs feel very deeply aggrieved by this. But at the same time, I think we also have to look at the broader context of this to say that, look, although this didn't fall within the usual patterns of international law, one also has to sort of look at the broader context of what had happened with Kosovo, look at the breakup of Yugoslavia. And in many ways, I mean, it becomes faintly odd, to put it mildly, that Montenegro, which shares so much in common with Serbia, for anyone who doesn't know, I mean, Montenegro, although they say they speak a different language now, it is essentially a dialect of Serbian. Maybe not even a dialect. I mean, it's the Montenegrins are much, much closer ethnically, religiously, linguistically, closer to Serbia than the Albanians in Kosovo. And yet Montenegro, which has a much smaller population than Kosovo, became independent, and yet somehow Kosovo had to remain part of Serbia. Even within Yugoslavia, it had a very special position. And then, of course, we had the whole context of the war that was taking place in 1998 and 99. So we end up in what I think amounts to a very complex situation on how to deal with the Kosovo situation. And it has been a source of great anger for many Serbs. And you talk about accusations of hypocrisy. I see where those accusations come from. But I also think that, at the same time, that there still needs to be some sort of agreed separation between Serbia and Kosovo. I just don't think that it makes any sense to try, and especially now that Kosovo declared independence almost 20 years ago and has been recognized by, not quite half the world, see the other answer, but certainly by a large number of states and significant states in Europe, to expect that just to be simply reversed is not going to make sense. But again, I think also that the problem is that, from the other perspective, Europe has never acknowledged the way that it dealt with Kosovo, and I think that this has been very, very problematic. That this has opened the door for these accusations of hypocrisy, and we see this the whole time. I mean, it's very telling that Russia uses the Kosovo precedent in saying, well, the West, you recognise unilateral secession of part of Serbia, we're going to do the same with the unilateral secession of part of Ukraine. And, for anyone who knows, I've absolutely taken an uncompromising position on Russia's invasion and occupation of eastern Ukraine. This is an absolute violation of international law. But we also have to recognise that Kosovo argument has gained a lot of traction in many places, that people say, well, this seems hypocritical. The West did this with Kosovo and Russia is doing that, and you're expecting... And I think this is something that's heard very, very loudly in the global South. And I've long felt that this is a real problem for European policymakers and Western policymakers, that they've never come up with a convincing answer to this. And it has created a problem. And there were, and I'm on record, I wrote about it in 2009, saying what happened in Kosovo, even though fundamentally I think that ultimately Kosovo's independence is the right thing, it has to be done in the right way. And it wasn't done in the right way, and it's created a problem. And I remember writing over 15 years ago, I think that this is going to have broader knock-on effects, and that's exactly what we've seen. And it creates a real problem in many ways when we talk about international relations. So look, I guess trying to come up with an answer for what you're asking, no, the EU will not go back on its Kosovo decisions. It has accepted that Kosovo is independent. I just simply can't see the terms under which it's going to go back on that. But on the other hand, I think Europe also needs to acknowledge that how it handled Kosovo, it handled it very, very badly, and it didn't think about the longer term and the broader implications of what it was doing in Kosovo. I think, you have to look at where Europe stood in the mid-2000s. It had stepped in 1999. It had, put Kosovo under international administration. Well, NATO had, and the United Nations. It wasn't going well. They needed to get out. They said, we can't put it back under Serbian rules, so we'll say Kosovo's independence and we'll say it's a special case and we'll just leave it at that. And of course, you don't have special cases in international law. And I think that this has created all sorts of problems that I don't think Europe, the United States and policymakers in those countries have ever really faced up to. Their view has simply been, well, let's continue to beat Serbia over the head on this and say you must accept Kosovo's independence. It's just a done deal, without thinking, what the bigger picture is on this and the problems that it has created. So yes, I think it somehow we've got to square the circle of the accusations of hypocrisy, and I think that can be done relatively easily. So one thing that history teaches us about state recognition is that each case ultimately becomes unique in its own right when you look back on it. That how that country eventually became independent disappears in the mists of time. That any illegality or anomaly that was linked with it, as soon as you have what we call the parent state's permission, the country it broke away with, as soon as it says, listen, we're happy to let it become independent, then all the problems surrounding that disappear. So essentially, we need to get Serbia into a position where it accepts Kosovo's independence, and I think we're still not there. I think a number of efforts have been made. I think a number of efforts have failed for reasons that I won't go into here, but I have talked about in other videos. So I think, as I say, I don't think we're going to see that decision to recognise Kosovo rescinded. I don't think Europe's going to do that, but I think Europe could do a far, far better job and needs to do a far better job in getting Kosovo and Serbia into a position where they agree on the terms of separation. Now, many Serbs will be really angry with that. They'll say, how dare you say that Kosovo should be separate from Serbia? This is our sacred territory. Yeah, I've heard it all before, but the reality is that this is a territory that there is a very strong argument it shouldn't have been part of Serbia any longer, that the rest of Yugoslavia had broken away. Kosovo had been a republic in all but name. It wasn't a republic. Before anyone jumps down, I know that, but it was a republic in all but name. It made sense to do this, especially when countries like Montenegro had become independent. But at the same time, as I say, Europe really needs to sort of understand that it made a mistake in how it handled this. It has led it to accusations of hypocrisy, and it has created real problems, and that we need to, on the one hand, get Serbia to accept that, but at the same time, and there will be many Kosovo Albanians who will equally be angry with what I'm saying, because I'm saying that, listen, in order to get full international acceptance, UN membership, you are going to have to sit down with with Serbia at some point and talk about what would be the terms of Serbia accepting this. It's not a done deal. This is still an issue that needs to be sorted out, and Europe could be doing a far, far better job in trying to get into that position. And I think it's done very, very badly over the years in doing that. So yes, I think you present a very, very interesting question. I don't necessarily agree with some of the points that you're making, but I think that there is this accusation of hypocrisy which has had far, far more serious impacts than people often realise, and I think does need to be addressed. I hope you found that interesting. If so, here are some more videos that you might like. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.